Hi everyone, I'm Zach Reinhardt, here to review the new World's End Girlfriend album, Last Waltz. World's End Girlfriend is a rather acclaimed, kind of experimental musician who experiments with kind of ambient electronics and trancey stuff combined with post-rock and with a little bit of classical music mixed in. His 2007 album, Heartbreak Wonderland, is probably a good starting point if you're looking to get into his stuff. But this album is his first album since 2010. This thing came out late 2016, and I'm finally getting around to it, wrapping up some stuff, some loose ends from last year. Now, in the past, I've always been fairly kind of neutral on World's End Girlfriend. I've never really been a huge fan, but I don't dislike his stuff either. And with a 6-year span between this and his last album, I wasn't really sure what we would be getting on here. Maybe we'd get some big change in his sound after all this time. This thing kicks off with the track Last Waltz, which has these icy, kind of resonant, high-pitched synthesizers and this like feedbacking kind of noisy guitar. They give off this very kind of creepy, eerie feeling. And when the guitar turns into these big distorted chords that are being just stabbed into this kind of amorphous mist of electronics and synthesizers, it gives off this very kind of horror movie aesthetic. The drums are very industrial and cut up, and they kind of vacillate between being fairly sparse and being really dense and kind of breakbeaty. More synths start coming in. This thing is just building in intensity. And this one lead synth that sounds almost like an opera singer starts doing this big, high-pitched kind of dramatic melody. And the whole song has a very theatrical air to it. It's very dramatic, melodramatic almost. The song is so dramatic and serious that I actually have a little bit of trouble taking it seriously. It's just so over the top. But it does serve its purpose well as the intro track. It's not too long, and it gives off the general mood and aesthetic that the rest of the album will be exploring. The next track, Plain Soleil, continues this kind of eerie atmosphere as this woman starts humming in a very kind of soft, reverby, distant voice, this kind of sweet melody that's then complemented by this melancholy chord progression that is played by these synths that almost sound like they come from like a Castlevania game or something. The soon-to-be very familiar kind of cut-up industrial drums come in as well. And this song kind of builds and builds over the next few minutes as more guitars and just more synths and strings as well come in. You get the very post-rocky kind of reverby, distorted, like tremolo-picked melodies on the guitar. And this song is one of the most blatant like post-rock tracks. If it weren't for all the kind of weird electronics and such, I could almost believe that this was a mono track or something. And for how kind of formulaic post-rock this is, it executes pretty well and definitely has some character of its own. It gets very hectic and intense towards the end. It has a very nice build and outro to it. There's even a guitar solo in here that sounds pretty nice within the kind of cavernous expanse of noise and electronics. You can still kind of hear the guitar somehow. And I think this is one of the better tracks on here. It doesn't go over the top with just crazy theatrics and such, but it definitely has that same kind of horror movie soundtrack aesthetic that a lot of the other tracks on here have. Skipping ahead to track 4, we have Flowers of Romance, which is a big, like 14-minute opus of a track. It is expansive. The song starts off with these kind of short, cut up vocal samples that I think are saying God and light, but I'm not sure. More of these kind of trancy ambient synths that are all over this album start to fade in and make this thing into just kind of a soundscape to begin with, really, until these vocal samples come in that start to form a more coherent melody out of it. The song is really slow paced, but constantly kind of changing and evolving. As the song progresses, strings come in and kind of take precedence over the electronics, and then further into the track, the electronics kind of revolt and take prominence once more at the beginning up until the end. And the first 5 minutes of this thing are really compelling. There's some really cool melody work and lots of stuff going on, but it's not too kind of dense and cluttered. There's still clear kind of direction and focus. But after that first kind of third of the track, it really starts to kind of lose me. Everything just gets so big and expansive and just kind of cavernous, and everything is just so over the top and theatrical that I have trouble really focusing on any one part of it. It feels like there isn't really a melody so much as there's a bunch of harmonies to a melody that doesn't quite exist. This track definitely has its merits, but it's just not for me. It's way too kind of soundtracky. It's way too theatrical and over the top for me to really grasp onto anything. It's not visceral enough. It's definitely intense, but it feels like it's supposed to be paired with some movie that I'm not watching. So I'm kind of missing half of the story. And that's a problem that pops up for me on quite a few of these tracks. I find that World's End Girlfriend on this album is at his best when he's doing something much smaller scale, like Plain Soleil, or like the track that comes after this one, Void. Void is a very short but very interesting piano piece with a whole lot of weird, glitchy kind of manipulation. The song starts off with just some softly played piano chords that are very reverby and resonant and really kind of echo in whatever room they're being placed in. And you keep getting these moments where it feels like the recording is glitching out or something. Like the piano will play a note and then that note will start twice. Like you'll hear da-da or something, or like there will be like short little cuts of silence in the middle of a long chord that make it sound like the record's skipping or something. And the song also gives this somewhat lo-fi kind of aesthetic when you can kind of hear what sounds like movement in the background. Like this was recorded in a room and one guy's playing the piano and they're recording that, but there's also somebody in the background like moving around or doing something. And as the song progresses, it gets more and more kind of dissonant and sour. The chords just keep getting a little bit more kind of diminished and minor and melancholy, and you get this kind of soft piano noodling that seems kind of random, that kind of clashes with the chords that are in the forefront. And over all this, you still get this kind of glitchy electronics that keeps building and building. And it's a really kind of weird aesthetic that I haven't heard before. It's a really cool track. The song In Silence / In Siren is another really nice track where World's End Girlfriend does something a little bit more simple. It starts off with these kind of pizzicato plucked violins. They're doing this really kind of bittersweet, kind of switching between major and minor chord progression, and we get some softly sung female vocals that are, I think, the first time that the vocals have had real lyrics, and it is a real kind of vocal track. More violin comes in, this time bowed, to play a nice kind of counter melody to the melody of the vocals. And it's just an altogether very pretty track. And when it hits the chorus, there's this big kind of cymbal roll that brings in all these drums and some electronics that really make the track expand hugely on the chorus and makes it really kind of epic. It calms down again on the verse, but it's just a little bit bigger now with drums and some more instrumentation, some more strings. And by the end of the track, we're in this huge kind of expansive climax with this kind of bed of noise in the background that kind of pads the whole song. It's a really nice track that shows that World's End Girlfriend can be this kind of big and explosive and cavernous and have these songs that can only be described as vast, but still be kind of tangible and down to earth at the same time. In Silence / In Siren is probably my favorite track on here for that reason. It's a really nice kind of middle ground between tracks like Flowers of Romance and something like you might consider a more poppy song. My least favorite track, however, is probably Girl, which is track number 9. It's the second to last song on here. And I really want to like this track just for how kind of noisy it is, and I love harsh noise, as you might know. And this song definitely has that. It's very kind of feedbacky and harsh and noisy in the beginning, with these kind of piano chords being a contrast to this expansive just noise and static. But the song builds in a really predictable way for World's End Girlfriend this late into the album, and it doesn't really build anywhere interesting. It kind of gets to this point where strings and all these electronics and all these kind of manipulated vocal samples come in, and you get this noisy, staticky, kind of fuzzy guitar. But it all builds into just an incredibly boring groove with no real thought put into it. It's just a melody over a boom boom ka boom boom ka kind of drum beat, which is the most basic kind of beat I've heard him do on the whole album. He does mess with it a bit more later into the song, but when compared with how kind of detailed a lot of the other tracks are, this song feels a little bit half-assed. I like the guitar and I like the kind of noise elements, but everything else is just a little meh, and the song comes off as really forgettable. And those are my thoughts on this album. I'm really kind of mixed on it. There's some really good moments and some highlights and some really kind of cool experimentation, but there's also some kind of less imaginative bits and some kind of meat and potatoes post-rock that doesn't really do anything new or all that interesting. The synths as well, I didn't mention this in any of the individual songs I talked about, but a lot of the synths on here are really kind of dated sounding. They sound like 10 years old. And in a world where you've got electronic experimenters like Food Man out there, the synths come off as really kind of obviously behind the times a little bit. They're a little too just trancey. But there's some songs I really like on here, and some songs that I'm definitely going to be returning into. In Silence / In Siren is a really nice track. I'm feeling a 6.5 on this album. It's just a real kind of mixed bag. But if you're into the more kind of expansive, over-the-top kind of soundtracky stuff, if you can handle that, it's not visceral enough for me, I find, but if you can get into that, there's definitely a lot of merits to this album, as well as his past albums. Like I said earlier, Heartbreak Wonderland is probably his most acclaimed work. But yeah, that's me. This is the new World's End Girlfriend album. It's called Last Waltz, and it's a real mixed bag. I'm real kind of torn on it. Peace.